So we are here with Mr. Pierre Vimont, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe and former Executive Secretary General of the European External Action Service. So we're here today at the premises of Carnegie Europe in Brussels to discuss with Mr. Vimont about the outcomes of the recent Trump-Putin meeting. So Mr. Vimont, what is your assessment on the Trump-Putin meeting? Was it a missed opportunity to address international strategic issues such as Ukraine, the arms controls regime, the Iranian deal, cooperation in Syria, and other contentious issues, or was it a success?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to your program. I'm sure we're going to have an interesting conversation because these are interesting times. What to say about this Helsinki summit? I think nobody had real or many expectations. It was as it was prepared, as it was seen. It was mostly a meeting of the two presidents who would rapidly go into some of the substantial issues you have been mentioning, but more than anything else, it was about two personalities meeting who hadn't had the possibility so far of having a full-fledged bilateral meeting. They had met in the margins of international conference, but they hadn't gone much further than that. And for me, it was a little bit like the summit that happened in Singapore a few weeks before with the President of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and as President Trump had underlined at the time, it was about two presidents meeting. It was seen as a meeting of the minds, as two presidents discussing to understand each other better, and with the main purpose of knowing whether they will be able to work together. But I think, as in Singapore, in Helsinki, the purpose was to feel that there was a good atmosphere between the two men, to decide on an agenda, and then to let their officials work on these and to meet maybe again when necessary. This, I think, was the main purpose of that summit. What changed, to some extent, the whole vision and the whole narrative about this summit was not the summit itself, but the press conference that took place afterwards, which in the end did not discuss much of the issues you related to, be it Syria, the nuclear deal with Iran, or other issues, Ukraine, for instance, but was mostly focused on Russian interference with American domestic politics and, of course, the presidential campaign of 2016. This, at the end of the day, was really what was the whole issue about the controversy that came out afterwards, and which, to some extent, left aside all the important foreign policy issues.
The official declaration of NATO released after the Brussels summit was very critical towards Russia, holding Moscow responsible for challenging the Euro-Atlantic security and stability through hybrid actions. However, the Helsinki summit was held only a few days after the NATO meeting, and President Trump did not address any of these controversial Russian actions. How can this be interpreted as far as the conclusion addressed in the Brussels declaration are concerned?
Now, first of all, from a technical point of view, these were not similar summits. You were talking about the NATO communique, and rightly so, but precisely, the NATO summit was a NATO very well prepared in advance by officials who prepare a draft communique. They discuss every word of that communique, and usually the communique is ready even before the leaders arrive. They just endorse formally a text that has been discussed, negotiated, prepared for a few weeks. This was not the case with the Helsinki summit, where there was no communique and where mostly the two men met in a very informal way, without their officials, and with the intention, once again, of getting a good feeling about how they could work together. Did they discuss in the end the issues you relate to? It seems that they at least hit at some of these, Syria, non-proliferation, Ukraine, so on and so forth. According to what the two presidents said, they went through the whole international agenda and once again decided that their officials should do more work on this. So it's not surprising, it's not entirely surprising, to say the least, that both men in their press conference were not as precise as the NATO communique was there. Where you are right is that the mood, as it transpired through the press conference, seemed much more friendly than the NATO communique. That's true. There was no harsh word from the American president on the issues you relate to. It was even, in a very interesting way, President Putin who reminded the media that President Trump had stick to the Western position on Ukraine and on Crimea. The American president didn't allude to it personally.
What about policy outcomes? The worst was avoided at this summit, and the damage to value that holds the EU-US alliance is considered significant, especially if linked to the last week's declaration of President Trump saying that the EU is a foe on trade and bashing European allies not spending enough on defense. Which future do you see for the Transatlantic Alliance, and what can both partners do in order to preserve it?
I would say personally that where the damage was really done was at the NATO summit, and not as much as the Helsinki summit, all the more so as we don't exactly know what was precisely discussed with regard to foreign policy issues. But the damage was done at the NATO summit, not for the statement itself, the communique, which was all very much in line, but for what all the different statements made in the margins by President Trump. The assessment that to some extent Europeans were more of a foe to the United States, that it was more difficult to discuss with them than it would be to discuss with President Putin, that Germany was a prisoner of Russia because of its gas imports, so on and so forth. And you could add what was said also in London, where President Trump was very critical of Mrs. May's negotiation on the Brexit issue with the EU. All this gave the impression that once again we had an American president who was no friend to the EU. We used to say that, in fact, what is the novelty with President Trump is the fact that he treats his allies and his foes in the same way. To some extent, after the NATO summit and the Helsinki summit, it looks even worse. It's that to some extent he treats more badly his friends than his foes, and that the real enemy for him seems to be the European Union, and he seems to endorse and support all those in Europe who are very critical of the European Union, the populists, be it in Hungary, in Germany, in Italy, for instance, or in Great Britain, with those who are supporting the Brexit. You hear more and more President Trump saying to some of his European allies, you should follow Great Britain and do exactly the same thing and leave the European Union. So we are facing a very strange situation, because if you look back at the history of the European Union, the way it was built up since the 1950s, it was always the United States which supported all these efforts towards more European integration. All the more so, as some people are saying, that the United States was one of the European powers. It was, to some extent, even if not formally a member of the European Union, a very close supporters of the European Union. And now you have an American president who acts as someone who seems to be an enemy, an open enemy of the European Union. So that's the real difference. And this is where Europeans feel somewhat uncomfortable, to say the least, with this situation. You were asking the question, what should we conclude with regard to the transatlantic relationship? I think one should make a distinction there between what relates to NATO, the military organization, which I think has shown its great resilience, even last week with its summit. The work is going on, the allies are making efforts, reassurance have been given. The Europeans are going to increase their military expenditure, reinforcement of our military capabilities at the borders with Russia in the Baltics, in Poland, elsewhere, is very much there. I think this seems to be going on well. With regard to the transatlantic partnership as such, the issue about values, do we share the same values? Do we have the same goals? Are we looking at the same perspective? There may be question mark, and this is where we need, I think, to go and dig deeper and try to understand in a better way what is this all about. Because one of the questions that now many European leaders have on their mind is this change of attitude mostly related to President Trump's personality. So do we have to accept that and live with that? Or is it something more structural, more substantial, that has to do with a change in the American society and with the fact that the Americans are moving back to a situation that we have seen in the past, even in the 19th century, where America was mostly looking at its own affairs, trying not to move out in the open world. Don't forget that it's only with the First World War that really America gets involved outside of the United States. Had a little bit of war in Central America and in Cuba with Spain in the 19th century, but apart from that, the United States was not an expansionist country. It was more isolationist. So you had this whole trend starting at the beginning of the 20th century and even at the beginning of the 21st century, where the United States decided to go out there in the open world. Are we witnessing a change of a trend there with an America much more inward looking? This is something that we have to look at more precisely, because if that's the case, then this puts a lot of responsibility on the Europeans to change some of their present policy and to take more responsibility as they move along in terms of security and defense, in terms of the role they want to play in the global international community. All these are questions that the Europeans need to address now, and that in the past they didn't like to address all too openly.
As you mentioned, Eastern Europe, on the one hand, the Brussels Declaration reaffirmed NATO's commitment to safeguard the freedom and security of all allies and stated that there can be no return to business as usual until Russia complies with international law. On the other hand, the US president has adopted a more lenient position towards Putin and Russia. In this context, is there reasons for the EU and especially Eastern European countries such as Poland or the Baltic states to feel concerned about US future decisions regarding Russia, especially in the light of Trump's recent declaration that suggests that he would be unhappy to defend Montenegro if it were attacked?
Yes, to some extent, and once again, this is not entirely new. You remember this special summit that took place last year here in Brussels, with all NATO leaders being there, everybody expecting President Trump to endorse once again what is called the Article 5 of the NATO agreement, namely the collective defense guarantee, and he didn't say a word about this. So afterwards his advisors, the defense secretary, all came out saying, well, he just forgot, but don't you worry, Article 5 is there and will remain there. It's the cornerstone of the Transatlantic partnership. And to hear once again, 1 year later, President Trump's seemingly questioning the whole Article 5 and the collective defense guarantee with regard to Montenegro, once again brings about some puzzlement and some concern about European allies. But that only reinforces what I was saying previously, is that among the European allies, the whole issue of should we start thinking a little bit more about some sort of autonomous European defense, while still keeping in line with NATO and sticking very closely with NATO, but at the same time adding something there, which is what a few years ago we used to call the European pillar of NATO, or something where there is a European identity inside the NATO system. This may be again a question that needs to be raised and that needs to be discussed among Europeans. And when I'm talking about Europeans, I'm particularly thinking about the 28, tomorrow maybe 27 members of the European Union, who, as you know, are starting to improve and enhance their capacities in the field of security and defense. The Commission, the European Commission, is going to put more money into this. They're talking about 3 billion per year in the years ahead. There is the French coming up with this idea of having an increased operational capacity for those European member states who are ready to work together. So this is something where you are witnessing progress, improvement, where in a few years ago there was very much stalemate and nothing much happening. So I think there is a link between the two. As a growing concern appears with the American capacity and willingness to stay in line with its allies and to guarantee their collective defense, as question marks are appearing on that side of the equation, you have the sense that more should be done between the Europeans on the other side, as a more autonomous capacity in terms of security and defense. Let's go right up to the end of this issue, because of course for a lot of members of the European Union, the might, the importance of American power in terms of military power is so important and still so necessary to guarantee our security, that it's very difficult to move from one system where you have the American security guarantee to another system where you're relying entirely on European security guarantee. You need both. And I think this is what you're going to see more and more in the months and years ahead, is that Europeans will try to play with both both sides of this Atlantic security problem, which is a system where you need to be able to rely on both the American security and the new nascent European will and capacity to offer also some security there.
And finally, the liberal international order has been preserved so far by the American global leadership. However, as President Trump is challenging this international order, do you think that European leaders should step in order to safeguard this model? And what do you think they should do concretely?
I think when you're talking about international order, you have to think of two different things. One is about security and defense, and there you don't have a really full-fledged international security order. You have the UN system, which is playing through peacekeeping forces, which need the consensus of all of them. You have some military alliance like NATO or alliance between other groups of countries, but you don't have a full-fledged international consensus on a security order. Hence, what you witness in the Middle East, for instance, in Syria or in Libya or elsewhere, in Yemen, hence the tension at the moment with the whole issue of the nuclear deal with Iran. And there, Europeans can certainly play a role in trying to bring more stability in that international order, but you need to accept the fact that we're still on very shaky ground, and it's still a system that doesn't have all the necessary stability. And then you have the economic international order, WTO, trade, finance, the G7, the G20, many different agencies. And there you have a more coherent international order that has adapted rules that are being applied by everyone. They don't respect always those rules, but you have the possibility for a recourse to a legal system, to judges inside the WTO or other agencies. There, what we're witnessing is also an economic international order that is under great pressure, because this order has created a lot of inequalities, a lot of injustice, and tensions are growing there between nations, inside each nations, where you're starting to have inside many European countries. To some extent, Trump election has to do also with that, with part of the middle classes who are very angry with this economic international order and the fallouts after the recent financial crisis. So you have a lot of discontent, distrust with regard to this economic international order. And there definitely Europe has a role to play in maybe taking the lead in trying to convince some of its partners. Think about Japan, think about India, think about Brazil, think about China, partners who could be interested in supporting reform inside that economic international order. And there I think Europe has a responsibility and to play there. Will it live up to expectations there, and will it be able to do something to come up with proposals? Very difficult to say. We're only at the beginning of this. But it's definitely Europe who could take the lead there, for one simple reason. It's precisely because the American leadership has somewhat disappeared at the moment and is not there anymore. Trump is definitely someone who's not interested in a multilateral order. He's looking for bilateral deals. He's looking, after all, only about American interest. And when you talk to him about working together to improve, review, revise the international order, he says he has no interest in that. What he wants to do is discuss with China, discuss with Europeans, but on a bilateral basis, face to face. He's not interested in rebuilding or revising the multilateral international order. There he shows no interest at all.
Thank you very much for this inspiring conversation, and thank you very much for your hospitality.